and thanks for the opportunity to come along and talk today. We are experiencing in the VRB some big numbers, some rises in people going for registration, so that's a really good sign and probably symptomatic of how strong the property market is. So that's all encouraging, and in fact Emma was just telling me before that on this webinar alone we've got 119 registrations. So that's pretty good effort, and again a sign that this is of interest to a wide cross-section of people. So good stuff. Hopefully this presentation will help you on your journey, you as graduates, and also we've widened out for supervisors this time as well to have a bit of discussion about their role in the registration journey, because it is a critical role and good opportunity for graduates and supervisors to sit together and reflect on what's coming ahead. I always say some of this information you would have heard before, but it takes 7 times quite often before you hear something for the first time. So that's my excuse for going over some old ground. Also believe that 90% of success is turning up, and so we're all here, 119 and myself and Emma, so let's get on with it. Okay, so the first point I'd make is, registration won't be easy, but it's definitely achievable, and to achieve it well you need to do careful planning now for the 3-year journey, so make sure you engage with your supervisor. Supervisors are vital. So in the past, in this presentation, we've pretty much focused it on the graduates themselves, but the board's increasingly aware of the importance of the role of the supervisor, and if you don't get that combination right, things can be difficult. So for this webinar, we've deliberately widened the target audience to include graduates and their supervisors. So thanks to all the supervisors who are online today. So it won't be easy, but we expect it will be worth it. When I come out of this, I'll be a butterfly. Maybe not quite, but the thing is that valuation fees have been rising steadily, demand for our services have been rising, and that bodes well for graduates coming through to registration. The other thing I hear a lot of is people who've been registered for a while, the sort of experience you gain as a registered valuer sets you up as a really good candidate for other types of quite senior property jobs. If after, say, 20 years in valuation or whatever, you want to move into something else, valuation's a really good base from which to go into other parts of the sort of wider property profession. I've heard many stories of people who've springboard off their valuation, and others who stay with valuation all the way on the journey and get a really rewarding sort of career out of that. So we expect it'll be worth it. Hopefully you'll agree. So just by way of introduction, it says it there on the screen, but the Valuers Act 1948 is here to stay. Well, for the moment, nothing's ever guaranteed, but certainly there's no energy at the moment to change the Valuers Act. And so long as that stays, we've got registered valuers. The long and short of it is, while there was some noise in the New Zealand property system after the global financial crisis and a bit of pressure on the role of valuers, at the moment the noise isn't that great, and there's plenty of other priorities to keep the government busy. So Valuers Act staying in place. We are a strong and well-respected brand, and we're well embedded into the property system, and I'd say long may this continue. There are some big opportunities for the next generation of valuers. That's the graduates who are out there. So it's worthwhile taking the time to carefully map out your registration journey with your supervisor. Make sure you have a partnership for success. There's no secret in the fact that the valuation profession is heavily loaded with members sort of 50 plus, and a number of those members are starting to retire, so the opportunities will be there. I'll talk a bit more about the partnership for success as I move through this presentation. But one thing I do like to do in terms of sort of context is say that why are valuers important? Why do we do this? You know, the thing about Simon Sinek always says people get why you do something, not what you do. And for me, the why is that the best performing economies in the world are built on the strength and transparency of their property markets. Property is the basis for lending and growth. Property is what drives jobs for Kiwis. It's what helps Kiwi kids stay in New Zealand. It's how we generate the level of income and action in our economy that we can build hospitals and roads and schools and all that sort of thing. So it's vitally important to the New Zealand system. You can have an open market economy, but if you don't also have a really robust, transparent and credible property system, you probably won't go very far. Of course, New Zealand's got an open market economy and a very well respected and trusted property system, and things have been going sort of gangbusters in the last few years. I think in the World Bank survey, we're second in the world for ease of doing business in the property system and confidence in our property system. Having said that though, some people say we're too successful. When I was growing up, there was 80% home ownership in New Zealand. We're down now to about 63%. And in parts of Auckland, it's under 50%. So there are tensions in having a strong property market, but I think overall, on balance, it's a positive thing to have. And of course, valuation is a critical component of the property market. It's a thing that helps with informed decision making. And the word I bolded there is independence. That's what we bring to the property market. We're not trying to create commissions or some kind of putting deals together. We're looking objectively at the market evidence in an independent way, and we're saying to the market, what's this property really worth? What are some of the risks, the SWOT analysis around sustainability of value and how we've got to that value. But valuers are busy whether the market's rising or falling. So it's a really crucial role, and what valuers do really matters. As I say, the property system is so important to New Zealand. The role of an independent advisor in that is also critical. That's where valuers are front and centre in that picture. Public confidence is critical, of course, and we all remember, or maybe we don't all, but I certainly remember after the 2008 global financial crisis, the public credibility of valuers took quite a heavy hit. We had places like the Serious Fraud Office talking about valuers for hire. And that was in relation to their view that valuers weren't being independent enough and they were being captured by the market to some degree. So that did dent our credibility post-2008. And what I would say as part of this journey for registration is that graduates and supervisors should sit down and have a chat about that time period, especially the supervisors that were there in 2006 to 2009. You know, what are the things that happened? Have a bit of a talk about the story of how the GFC developed, what the causes were and how that impacted on valuation, because history has a way of repeating itself, as we know. It's good for graduates to be aware of some of the fundamentals that were at play in the lead up to that global financial crisis. If you're a supervisor that wasn't there in 2008, you might have to try and find someone else who can help supplement that story. But I'm a great believer in older valuers talking to younger valuers about the history of what's happened, what were the circumstances in the economy, what were some of the key triggers and reasons for why the economy or the property market actually went really well or really badly, so that if those signs start to come up again in the future, people are much more aware and looking for them, able to identify what's going on. Professional robbers. So here I am saying how great our profession is and everything and how important we are. But by the same token, we need to stay really relevant. We've got to remain valued by business and public, or someone will steal our place. It's a bit like the old Tower ad. Everyone's trying to steal your stuff. You know, so if it's real estate agents, accountants, AVMs and now AI, this whole artificial intelligence movement that's happening. There's always someone out there trying to steal your stuff. So we've got to make sure that our offering is of a high standard, very credible and trustworthy. And my general advice to valuers, I think we've got to work with things like AVMs, GIS, AI, all these new things. We've got to get on board and find where the added value part is for valuers, because they're coming and we can't just put our hand up to stop them. We've got to find our interaction point with them. Okay, so that was a bit of context, I guess, around why the profession is so important and why we've still got an act that puts in place registered valuers, and some of the thoughts about the go forward on it. I'll just get down now to a little bit more detail around the sort of heading of what this presentation was meant to be, graduates and supervisors. So if I just mapped out what I see as a supervisor's role, it probably fits into these 5 key things. So it's worth just going through those, and then I'll elaborate a bit later on about how you might achieve some of these things. But number 1 is to set up a 3-year pathway program with your graduate that you both adhere to. So sit together, go through the registration requirements manual, which is available from the LINZ website, and deliberately map out the 3-year journey to registration. Even if you're some way on that journey and you haven't mapped it yet, still a good thing to do. Sit down now for the remaining time you've got. Use a 6-monthly review process and mark against a template of expectations for each part of the discipline. And what I mean by the discipline is the sort of sub-components of, if you're doing residential, all the different parts of residential valuation that you need to master over the 3 years, or commercial or rural or whatever you're doing. Supervisors should encourage study groups and industry participation with peers. So take your graduates to auctions, let them see the bidding process, the sale of a property, how it all works. Take them on construction sites. Go and have a look at a house that's part complete with all the framing there, and just work through what are the different components of the construction of this property, or commercial building or industrial, whatever it is, milking shed. Take your graduates to have a look at a leaky building. Go and see one in the flesh. Go and have a look at even a weatherside house. I mean, most graduates are probably scratching their head about what's this weatherside stuff, but a lot of supervisors will be thinking back to years gone by and the problems we've had with that. So yeah, take your graduates out on site and actively show them these things that will impact their career as they go forward. Ensure that graduates attend relevant CPD, including the standards and ethics. And again, with a good turnout today, I thank the employers that have allowed their graduates and supervisors to be involved in a session like this. Test your graduates on their knowledge to meet the board's criteria for registration. You know, actively sit down and run through some mock exams. As the time's getting closer, work through, vary through your firm if you've got other people you can use, and test your graduate. How well can they articulate the state of the market and what's driving the market, and how well can they explain sort of specialist valuation methodologies within the general property type that they're working on. So I think if you can do all 5 of those things, and as I say, I'll give a bit more detail as we go. We're only 15 minutes in, so plenty of time. Those are the things that we'd like to see supervisors providing. And for graduates, what's the graduate's role? Pretty simple, really. Work for an employer that offers 1 to 5 on the previous page. That's where you want to be. It's that important. Get with an employer that will spend the time and help you on this journey towards that professional achievement. Okay, I'll get down into a bit more about the things that make or break the registration exam and the points that you need to know about. So one of those key things is the standards, not surprisingly. So what I'll run through here is 4 sort of high-level things that are really fundamentals for any graduate coming to the registration exam. And that is our current IVS 217, but it might change by the time you come for registration, so keep an eye on that. And the Australia and New Zealand Valuation and Property Standards 2009. There's also the Code of Ethics. There's the Registration Requirements Manual that I mentioned earlier. And importantly, there's this legislation and government policies, which I'll touch on in a moment. So coming back to the standards, IVS 217, why do we have those standards? Why don't we just have our own New Zealand standards? Well, New Zealand is in a global market now. Part of what I was talking about around how our economy is doing so well is because we're attracting a lot of investment in from overseas. And those overseas investors want to know that in New Zealand we're using the same valuation standards, whether it's in Auckland, Amsterdam or Albania. They want to make sure it's a level playing field, that the valuers are approaching the assignment in the same way globally. The standards drive the credibility of our profession. They're not just a compliance exercise, they're a very big part of the registration exam now. So you need to know them and ensure that your reports, your 20 reports, comply properly with what the standards require. So if you're asked what valuation standards we use in New Zealand, don't just say the current ones. Now that might sound a bit facetious, but I've sat in exams where graduates haven't known what they are, IVS, Australia, New Zealand valuation standards. They haven't been sure about them. So the answer comes back, we're using the current ones. Obviously that's not a great place to start the exam from. You should be able to name the documents, as I've just alluded to. You should also be able to give a little bit of history of the past standards and sort of what's on the horizon. So how have the standards changed over the last 10 years? We've had a number of iterations of the International Valuation Standards, and there is information from PINs around the history of the changes of those standards. So that's good stuff to learn and put out there during the exam that demonstrates you've spent the time to go back and get an understanding of all that. There is the NZIV sort of Standards Committee A3 diagram, which summarises the current makeup of all the standards that we're using. So every graduate and their supervisor should get a copy of that, make sure they're aware of them all. So IVS 217, it's X1 July 217. It's made up of sort of 5 key parts: scope of work, investigation and compliance, reporting, basis of value, and valuation approaches and methods. So you need to know about that and some of the sort of sub-tier things you need to know about. Make sure you have a scope of works for each job and that it covers the detail as set out in IVS 101 at point 20.3. So there's a number of things that you need to cover off in your scope of work, and if it's one thing I still notice, there's a number of firms either aren't referring to the scope of work, or if they are, they don't always cover off all the key parts that are set out there in IVS 101. So go back and have a look and make sure your scope of work is up to speed. A scope of work is a better tool than putting report disclaimers in, because at least with the scope of work it's agreed by sort of both parties up front and the scope of work is signed off, and then that's what you're working to. It gives the valuer a lot more certainty about what they need to do and what's expected. And of course IVS 103 at 20.3, the report must be sufficient for an experienced valuation professional to review and understand it. It's got to be clear on the valuation basis and approach, key inputs, assumptions and reasons for conclusions. So we're still having some issues with reports around linking the valuation evidence to the final valuation assessment. Make sure when you go back over your reports that you're submitting for registration, that there is a clear link between the evidence you've got and how you've used that to get to your answer. This is another area that we're finding a lot of variation amongst valuers, and that's in terms of IVS 104, valuation approaches and methods. So in the IVS 217, there are only 3 approaches: market, income and cost. So get that terminology right. Every time you use the word approach, it can only be prefaced by either the word market, income or cost. Now, within the approaches, there are then sub-tier elements which are methods. So for the market approach, a site value or a net rate, those are both examples of methods, not approaches. Under the income approach, capitalisation of rent and DCF would be examples of methods, and under the cost approach, discounted replacement, depreciated replacement cost would be one of the methods that you could use. So go back to your reports and make sure every time you use the word approach, it's only prefaced by market, income or cost. What we are noticing as well now, and relevant to what I was talking about in terms of the level of property ownership in New Zealand, particularly in parts of Auckland down to less than 50%, a lot of residential valuers are putting in both a market approach and an income approach. So that's something to think about as a cross-check nowadays where you're working in a strong investment residential area. We're seeing some of this as well in the rural scene. For really high production farms, a cross-check method which is done on the income from the farm. Just make sure in your report that you use the term market value, not current market value. It's no longer current market value. The next day you've done your evaluation, it's no longer current. So the standards have changed. Go through your reports and make sure you're not using the term current. Can you average or weight your valuation conclusion based on different approaches or methods? Go and have a look at what that says in IVS 105 at 10.4 and 10.6. But the essential message there is that you can't do averaging to get to your valuation. Can unconfirmed offers be used as evidence? So have a look in IVS 105 at 30.3, and that talks about offers and asking prices and how you might use that evidence as part of your way of building up the market value. Obviously for valuers, if you've got enough sales, that's great. But sometimes in the market, if it's shooting ahead quickly or it's falling quickly, particularly falling, you may not have many actual sales, and then you have to go and look at sort of second tier evidence. So be quite clear what the standards say about that. I still get a lot of valuers saying, oh, you can't use offers at all, it has to be sales. Go and check that through what IVS says. The Australasian valuation standards. There's one that's still compulsory there, that's the compulsory acquisition standard, so you need to know about that. Guidance notes are mostly still relevant. They are shifting to become tips, so you need to know what does a tip mean and where are we on that journey of converting guidance notes into tips. Some key guidance notes you need to know about are the real property ANZ VGN1. And a sub-tier in there that catches a lot of people out with checking is make sure you know the in one line valuation requirements. What's meant by a gross realisation as opposed to a market value, and how do you move from a gross realisation to a market value? Because this is one area we've seen some issues in recent times on the board, so I'd certainly encourage that. Mortgage recommendations, ANZ VGN2, what's the current state of play on what valuers have to do around mortgage recommendations. NZR PGN2, countersigning, that's really relevant to graduates and their supervisors because all your reports will need to be countersigned, so every report you submit for registration should reference that guidance note. Another one that is good to know about, I haven't got on the list here, is the International Property Measurement Standards. Where are we at with those? Make sure when you come for your exam you're up to speed with where the New Zealand valuation profession is with international property measurement standards. So there's certain standards for residential, there's commercial, industrial. Make sure you're aware of the current status, how we're treating those. Code of Ethics. So we've got the NZIV Code of Ethics from 1996. There's also a PINS Code of Ethics, but they're two quite different documents. So you need to know what the difference is between the two. Handy to know who signs off the NZIV Code of Ethics. So over 30% of the complaints the board gets are ethics-based. So make sure you're well familiar with what the requirements are of the NZIV Code of Ethics. You might even get a question on it. The Registration Requirements Manual. As I say, this is a very helpful sort of guideline tool that the board updates regularly. It's available on the LIMS website. Go through it, read it, highlight the key parts, the things that really impact on what you need to do, so you're quite clear. Whether you highlight it in a hard copy with a marker pen, or you do it virtually with shading and that, then however you want to do it, make sure you've gone through and you've highlighted the bits that are relevant to your registration journey and exam. We need 20 reports that I've alluded to. It's got to have full workings and evidence that's linked to the answer. The VRB want to see reports that comply with the standards and explain the methodologies used. It has been a bit of a recent stumbling block for examinees. So a graduate through the exam process could do okay generally in the exam, but if their reports are not up to standard, that could hold them back. Legislation and government policy. So the current government intervention in the New Zealand property market has increased significantly and could be more to come. So you need to be aware when you're talking about the market you're working in and what's influencing it, what is the government legislation. So Overseas Investment Act 2018, ban on foreign buyers for existing residential property and various rural restrictions. Need to know about that. The Reserve Bank's role in the economy, loan to value ratios. So they're a very effective tool, as we've seen. How do those LVRs vary whether you're a first home buyer, an investor, someone who wants to build a new house? Just be really clear on where the tolerance levels are sitting for lending for LVRs. Healthy Homes Guarantee Act 2017. So residential tenancies have to comply by 1 July 2024. What impact is that having on the market and what's that all about? Tax Working Group, new tax options for 2020 election. So bright lines increased to 5 years, and the political parties will make a call on what they want to include in their manifesto when they go to the 2020 election. So be clear on what they're signalling there. Seismic zone codes across the country. There's 4 codes. Make sure you know what code affects your location and what the requirements are around strengthening or demolishing buildings that are under the standard for seismic. District flood plain protection ordinances. So this has become a lot more topical in recent times with flooding events. What's your council doing? What's the plan requirements for rebuilding? How's that impacting the market? Is it impacting the market? We've heard recent stories about insurance premiums and availability of getting insurance. You've got to be careful in your market. Is that a factor that's influencing the prices, and how does that play out? And if it is, explain that during your exam. New Ministry of Housing and Urban Development, so affordable housing, a big push from the current government to try and ramp up the supply side of the property market. Just be aware of these things and have a look at each one, and as you're coming in for your exam, what's the current state of play for those things, and has there been any new or emerging legislation or policy announcements. Right, let's get back to the registration journey and the exam criteria a bit more closely. So what's the first time pass rate? Currently running at about 75%. It was 80%, but it has slipped back a bit with these report compliance issues. So not linking the evidence to the answer, not explaining the right approach or sub-methods that have been used. So got to be careful around that. So the VRB isn't there to try and fail applicants, far from it, but we do have to measure whether we think there's a reasonable level of competence that's been achieved, because once you're registered, you're out there in the big wide world. So I'll run through some detail of the sort of registration requirements. A lot of them are quite simple messages, but I guess if you miss them, they could become critical for you. So tune in, we're about halfway through. So keep the focus going, and we'll move through some more detail of the kind of things you need to do specifically for your registration exam. So I think there's 4 key bits in the registration cycle. There's the sort of preparation. This is once you've graduated. This is the steps now, the 3-year journey from graduation through to registration. So there's the preparation part. There's ongoing education, and that's learning as you're moving through those 3 years. There's the application for registration, and then the examination. So I'll go through some bits of those. So under preparation, supervisors and graduates, as I mentioned earlier, supervisors will sit down with their graduates and work on the valuation specialist areas and try and determine the sort of area that you're going to work in and locations and the type of work you're going to do. You'll get a planning and employer commitment to a 3-year pathway to try and cover off all the key aspects of what that property type valuation requires. The reports, we want mostly recent reports, so I generally look for 12 reports in the year leading up to registration, particularly if the standards have changed significantly in that time period, but even if they haven't, still weight heavily your report sample towards the sort of 10 months leading into registration. Make sure you've got a range of valuations for each property type. So if you're doing residential, we don't just want to see houses and vacant sections. We want to see those, but we also want to see reports that cover things like a subdivision, an income earning property, a block of flats, something like that, a before and after valuation, an off the plans valuation, unit entitlement, unit title type valuation, even a cross lease valuation. And just touching on that cross lease, one good thing to know in the exam is what that term cross lease actually means. A lot of valuers are valuing cross lease properties, but when we ask them in the exam, what does the term mean? They're not too sure. So that would be a tip to make sure you're fully aware of what that terminology cross lease means. But anyway, the essential point I'm making is that if you're doing residential, you need to have a range of different residential sub-property types. Or if you're doing, say, commercial, we'd want to see a range of commercial types, market value, rent review, feasibility study, maybe lessor, lessee interest type valuations, a decent range, not just all market value. And likewise, rural, a bit of lifestyle, productive values, maybe conversion properties, that sort of thing. Always make sure you've got your scope of works in those reports and you've referenced the right international valuation standards and guidance notes. Make sure you give us good local market comments about really good detail of what's happening in your market, and also check off the title memorials. We notice a few candidates come through and they haven't properly read the title, and we might ask them, so what does that mean, that registration on the title? So just go through, you only got 20 reports there. It's a good discipline to have anyway, but particularly for the 20 you submit for registration, make sure you've looked through the title and you're clear on what each one of those memorials excuse me, means on the title. If you use 2 or more valuation methods in your report, make sure you've got an answer for each one, and then you sort of reconcile those 2 valuations at the end of the analysis of the value. So if you say you've done a site value and a net rate method, what we'd expect to see is an indicative value by site value, indicative value by net rate, and then some sort of reconciliation describing why you've gone with your valuation answer. As you analyse, so you value. That's a phrase you need to have locked in your head throughout the whole of your career as a valuer. There shouldn't be anything that turns up in the summary valuation that hasn't been shown in the analysis of the sales. So if you're doing a net rate conclusion to your value, we'd expect to see that all the sales evidence would have been analysed to a net rate. Check that your analysis and valuation conclusion makes sense. Go through, reread it, get your supervisor to check over it again. Make sure the numbers add up, the valuation numbers, and that it's signed off. So it is a really important check. The number of times we get reports that come in and there hasn't been a good check done to see, well, look, they've used net rates to summate their final value, but there's no net rates in the sales evidence. Or if you're doing net rates, then really you should have land value sales in there as well, because how do you justify your net rates without sort of land value sales analysis too? So make sure you've got all that key data in those reports. That's just a nice wee break for me to have a drink of water, but I think that slide illustrates, you know, you do need to have good data in there. We don't want reports that don't make sense or haven't been checked properly to make sure numbers add up and that the evidence is linked and everything's flowing properly. So from your reports, if you're doing residential, you want to see a range of net rates if that's the method you've used. In your reconciliation between your evidence and your final value, you should be explaining why you chose a certain level of net rate for the subject property. So you've got a range of net rates, I don't know, $1,200 to $2,000, and you chose $1,800. So why did you choose that level, and what were the sort of 2 really key sales from your basket of evidence that really pushed you to go to that level? Same with commercial industrial, you've got a range of rentals and a range of cap rates. What were the sort of really key sales that you decided to go with this level of rental and this particular cap rate? Use of things like superior, inferior, comparable, they're still useful, but only if they're brought together in that summary narrative near the end of the report where you're linking the evidence to the answer. If your land value is greater than 50% of your overall value, you should really have comparable land sales in there. And as we discussed earlier, if you're using net rates, you need comparable land sales. If you're a rural valuer, then you need rural qualifications. Likewise, if you're a commercial or industrial valuer, you really need the relevant commercial industrial qualifications. We're getting a few people now who are swapping over. They might have gone to university, done an urban-based valuation degree, and then move into a rural discipline for their career. You should really get the rural academic papers that go with that. And vice versa, if you've done a rural degree, you've probably covered off enough for residential and lifestyle, but you would need to go and get commercial and industrial papers to really demonstrate the level of academic qualification. You need a good range of experience. You need to know the different methodologies that apply, the case law, the different standards and the tips applicable. Sometimes you need some quite good quality mentors. If you don't have those mentors in your firm, it's worthwhile going out and trying to find someone who can help you if it's a specialist element, say lessee, lessor interest, something like that. Is there somebody who can give you a bit of mentoring in those areas if you're going to be doing that sort of work? Study groups, the board's really quite keen on study groups. What we notice is that applicants from study groups do a lot better. So use your initiative to set up a study group if you can, even if it has to be done remotely over a Skype type arrangement. The board wants sort of solutions, not problems, so we want to hear from people. If you're in provincial areas and there's no one else going for registration around you, you've actually done a hookup, a link up with somebody else in another provincial area and use that method to improve your awareness. Role play, so supervisors, I mean, this is a really critical part. Again, the graduates that come into the exam who spend a bit of time doing a role play with their employer or their mentor, mock sort of interviews, mock exams. They're much more calm and composed and able to articulate a really good presentation of what they know about valuation and what the market's doing. Some people even go to the point of videoing themselves so they see their mannerisms and then they can correct that if they want to prior to the exam. You don't have to go that far, but some people do. But this is a key point as well. Just get used to the sound of your own voice. Graduates, you know, when you first come into that exam, if you haven't got used to yourself answering questions, it can be a bit intimidating. But if you've got used to it and you hear your voice and you're ready for that, then it makes the whole journey a lot easier. It's just one more thing that's on your side to promote your chances. Make sure you keep a good record of your CPD. You know, where was it that you went to? Who presented? When was it? What was it about? Explain the sort of key messages and learnings and how you apply those learnings you got from the CPD day or session, whatever it was, to your day-to-day work. So I often say in these presentations, you know, start here today, write down sort of 5 key things that you've learned from this presentation, and by all means, if you wanted to, you could regurgitate that back at the exam and say, during my CPD, I did this webinar, listened to this fella talking about stuff, and I took these 5 things out of it, which I then applied in my day-to-day and also on my journey towards registration exam. So make sure you can talk a bit about some of the key CPD you attended. Once again, a bit like the standards, you know, the current ones, we'll often ask the graduate, so this bit of CPD you did here, who presented it and what was the essence of what they were saying? And if you get a graduate going, oh, I think his name is John or something, I'm not quite sure what he was on about, you know, that's not very convincing. So take the initiative, think about 3 to 4 key bits of CPD you've done and be ready to talk to those so that you're in control a bit more in the exam process. And we always recommend a standards and ethic module before you come into the registration exam. The application part of the process, you know, confidence is what it's all about. Are you ready? You've got your 3 years experience, and then you can apply for VRB time credits if you've done work that sort of is aligned to valuation or property. You have to write into the registrar and you have to be quite specific about when you did this work and what exactly it entailed and how that relates to a valuer's role. And then the board will weigh that up and may give you 3 months, may give you some more, or may give you nothing, depending on what they think of your articulation of the related work. But you can sometimes get some credits. Once you're set to go, apply for registration. Now, you have to have done your 3 years before you put your application in. You can't apply in anticipation of doing the 3 years. That's just the way the board interprets that piece of the Act. So you need to do your 3 years, which may include some credits. and then you apply. The referees, you have to put in 3 referees, of which 2 have to be registered valuers. VRB really scrutinises those references very closely. Do they support you? So make sure you spend some time around what does your supervisor think in terms of are you ready to go for the registration exam. It can be quite a blunt and difficult question, but you've got to be confident, you've got to be ready, and you've got to know that your supervisor and your other referees think that you're right and ready to go. We welcome employer attendance at the exam, so I've noticed in recent years an increased swing of employers coming along and sitting in the examination time. During the exam, the VRB uses an exam scoring matrix. The general time allocation is you've got 1 hour to prepare 3 scenario questions and answers, and then there's a 2-hour sort of oral exam where we work through those scenarios and other things. And we score the performance that you do during that exam. But make sure you get your evaluation principles out there, demonstrate your technical knowledge, be passionate. After all, your exam is the culmination of sort of 6 years of learning, 3 in university and then another 3 post-graduation. So come in with a bit of energy and passion, and that always sets a much better impression. Can't someone else just do it? No, you're doing it, so you need to show that exam passion and put yourself in a really good light. As I say, showcase all the things you've learned. So the examination itself, we'll have a bit of a chat to you about who you are and why you're in the hot seat for the exam that day and wanting to become a registered valuer. We'll look to you for a bit of a commentary about the general and local market conditions that you're working in. So we'll ask you to nominate your specialist property type, residential, commercial, industrial, rural, dairy, pastoral, whatever, and talk to that market. Initially, we're looking for the sort of New Zealand economic story, and then we'll go down into your more localised regional story. So it's a bit of macro and a bit of microeconomic stuff. We're looking for macro in terms of OCR, LVRs, interest rates, things like tourism, dairying, migration, employment, New Zealand dollar, political interventions. What are all these high-level things that are impacting on the New Zealand property market? We'll expect you to give us a pretty good coverage of all those things. So you'd want to know, what are the migration figures into New Zealand annually? How's that changed in the last 5 years? What's the migration into your region? So you might know that New Zealand's got, say, 60,000 people coming in, but if you're in Dunedin, how many of those are going to Dunedin? That's the level we'd expect you to be able to get to. A market overview in your expert area, so whatever you say is your key component of expertise, you need to know all the relevant facts really thoroughly. Things like sales volumes, how have they changed? Prices, median prices, supply demand, rental level changes, vacancy, all that sort of thing. Median prices, days to sell, how much stock is on the market. It gets down to quite a detailed situation because once you're registered, you are expected to be an expert on all those the key data elements that impact on how the values are made up. Case law, we want to know that you've grasped the principles of it more than the wider story probably. We want to know that you're aware of things like common law development. So if you're not sure what common law development is, you should do a bit of research there. An example of common law development is the Headley Burn case leading into the Yarny Evans case. So why am I saying that? What differed between those 2 cases that could be categorised as sort of common law development? We'd like to hear about any examples of how you apply case law in your daily work. And I can say that the PIN's case law notes are back up on the website. Again, Emma's nodding, so they're up again. They were off for a while, and there is quite a comprehensive schedule in there of all the different cases impacting on property valuation in New Zealand. So make sure that if you're a residential, if you're doing subdivision, you know all those cases like Boat Park, Prestige Homes, Carlton Heights, etc. If you're a commercial valuer, you know all those sort of key cases like Sagana, any number of Feltex, any number of cases that relate to commercial and industrial. Sometimes people actually voice record the case notes and play them back. Don't know if you have to do that, but I have seen some graduates do it. But the good news is those cases are back up and available on the PIN's website. Insurance, this has become a much bigger deal since the Christchurch events and flooding events. So there are questions, particularly for commercial valuers who are doing insurance type work. Where do modals and multiples come from? What's the law of diminishing value as regards depreciation? Inflation provisions. How do you differentiate between CPI and building inflation? Demolition. What are the various methods of trying to calculate demolition? And remembering that the loss may occur on the last day, and why is that relevant to an insurance certificate? Case law, Falcon case, make sure you know that. Two types of indemnity. What is the Falcon case an example of? Time value of money, discount rates versus capitalisation rates, make sure you're clear on that. Four sort of key factors in a discount rate, how you build up a discount rate effectively, using things like the risk-free rate, inflation, asset type, and then the sort of specifics of the subject property, the lease term and conditions. How does that all factor into building up a discount rate? Rent review process, dispute resolution process. If you're doing commercial industrial and you're involved in these things, you need to be really clear on what's the difference between a mediation as opposed to a conciliation or an arbitration or an expert determination. Obviously an arbitration has got statutory components and there's very tight criteria that go with that, whereas some of the others might not be quite as formal, but you need to know the valuer's obligation under each of those. Residential sales analysis, it's always got to be land value first plus value of improvements equals the capital value. We still see a few people referring in their reports with land as an occupied site. Land should be valued as vacant, and the improvement value is the added value they give to the land. For rural valuers, land use issues have become way more prominent in recent years. The RMA's changed a lot. Land and water management plans, irrigation schemes, nutrient discharge issues, impact of foreign buyer restrictions, dairy payout levels, Fonterra auctions, all that kind of thing you'd want to know about. And as I mentioned earlier, you might also want to know a bit about using income approach valuations for high production farms. Hypothetical subdivision, this is often a question that gets thrown out there during the exams. So the first thing you probably should do before you start answering the question is read the question and draw a plan of the development that you've got in your head for how the hypothetical subdivision might look. During your day-to-day work, you wouldn't launch into a hypo sub exercise without having a reasonably good idea about how the sections are going to look, where the roading would be. So make sure when you come into the exam, you spend some time just setting out what your plan of development looks like. Where does profit and risk come from? Is it from case law or is it from sales? Be clear on that. And what we're hearing a lot more these days is valuers talking to developers directly and asking them about the levels of profit and risk they're looking for when they take on certain developments. And that seems to be a good source of information from the horse's mouth, I guess. There's elements of how you treat GST. You've got to be quite clear on what your realisation period is for your hypo sub. What's the case law that goes into hypo sub? What's this term interest on outlay? So in effect, what does that opportunity cost mean? So just make sure you're clear on all those different components of the hypo sub process. Construction, this is probably an increasing area where there's a lot more questions asked about this. So in residential, it's knowledge of the house ages, what's a villa, what's a bungalow, what's the building components, what's the structure of the house, what's a hip roof, as opposed to something like skirting or a lintel, an architrave. What's a mullion? I say there it's not a lotto prize, it's a term in the building construction process, and you might be asked what a mullion is. And what's the materials? Materials are changing quite quickly these days, particularly exterior claddings and finishing systems. What's the different types of materials that have been used in the building game over the years and also currently? What's the characteristics of a sort of leaky building, monolithics? And what's the characteristics of earthquake-prone buildings? What are you got to be watching for? For commercial and industrial valuers, what's the building services? What services are in that building and the materials that make that building, both inside and out? I've got there, know your office ceiling. You might get a question that says, look up at the ceiling and point out what are the different things there. There's bits that are protruding down and bits that are flush into the ceiling. What do each one of those things do? Almost there, that's no chance to have a drink of water with how long to go, 3 minutes. Always keep learning and checking things. Don't be frightened to challenge things with your supervisor. And supervisors, be prepared to listen to the grads, if they've gone to study groups or they've attended CPD and they come back and say, hey, I'm not sure we're describing that approach or that method quite right. I'm not sure that we're really linking our evidence to the answer correctly. Be prepared to work with the graduate there and if necessary, make the changes. Because as I say, we still see a lot of reports coming through where the board has got some critique of the compliance with the standards. Okay, so just by way of conclusion, supervisors and graduates plan together for a successful registration journey. This is a really critical part. The role of the supervisor is vital to share with the graduate and help them get to that really high quality finished product. Be really aware of the political landscape affecting New Zealand property and stay current with the changes. And when you come to your exam, what legislation has changed, what new policy announcements, what's key industries like insurance, what's happening there. Practice your role play for the exam. Can't stress this enough. Get used to the sound of your own voice, get used to answering questions and articulating your thoughts in a smooth way as you can while trying to remain calm and composed. It's a good thing to keep practicing that. Know your standards, ensure your reports comply, and look, good luck for registration and then on to ANZIV a year or so later. So thanks for listening. Hope this helped. If there's time for some questions, we could do that. See, Brendan, that you would get a insurance question if you hadn't put one through if you're a residential valuer. The board probably don't think that's such a key part of the residential portfolio to have to focus in on it. If you were a residential valuer though that was doing insurance type work, then there's a fair chance you will get an insurance question. The insurance question is probably more likely to go to a commercial or industrial valuer who's probably doing that work more routinely. I prefer that you would have a rural academic background if you're doing rural valuation. It may not be impossible to demonstrate competency, but I think what you'd have to do is have pretty good knowledge of farm management techniques, and you also had to have worked in some fairly intense training system with a high quality rural mentor to be able to get up to a standard where the board would think you're competent to do rural valuation if you've only had an urban degree. No, probably not, Charlie. I mean, we're not cruel on the VRB. We do sort of take a good look at what you'd put in as being your prime area of valuation focus, and we do try and tailor the questions to that sort of thing. So it would be a bit mean to give you residential construction and net rate analysis if you were purely doing commercial and industrial. So we wouldn't do that. What we might do is ask you about capital value net rate or whatever the equivalent thing is as a method under the market approach to working out the value of a commercial or industrial building. Residential or lifestyle type thing, Sam, but what you could get is a question or a bit of a discussion around sort of feasibility analysis. So commercial area where there's a tension between highest and best use of, is it a high density residential proposition or is it a commercial proposition? What's the land value, highest and best use and likely use? You might get some questioning around feasibility study and how you'd sort of work out which was the highest use for the land. But I wouldn't expect if you're commercial industrial that you'd get a residential type subdivision question. Yeah, so Zane, if you're doing horticultural stuff, if that's your main area, kiwi fruit and avocado orchards, you would need to know about the methods that are relevant. I mean, they still probably fall under the market approach and possibly the income approach, but you would need to know about the factors that are relevant to kiwi fruit and avocado orchards. So when you're analysing your sales, what are you taking out for the crop or the improvements, how are you working out your base land values? You would be expected to know that. Yes, farming knowledge and methodologies. No, again, you know, that we would see there's a sufficient distinction, and the board would realise that there are people that can work solely now in a sort of horticultural field or solely in a pastoral dairy type field, and that they are two distinct things, just as commercial and residential are. So we wouldn't be expecting you to know the ins and outs of the dairy industry if you're primarily a kiwi fruit or an avocado valuer. Yeah, there definitely is. That's a question about if you sit your exam and pass it on residential, is there anything to stop you from then doing commercial valuation once you're registered? And the thing that would moderate that is the code of ethics. So this is where it's important to know where that fits into the building block of our profession. So part of our code of ethics says you have to be competent to do the valuation work. So if you were pretty much a residential valuer and then you didn't take steps to get up your competency for commercial and industrial, there might be an issue. But it wouldn't stop you as long as you were competent and you'd done the background work and worked with the right mentors and were able to do those commercial valuations, then you would be able to do them even though you got registered as a residential valuer. That's right, Kristen, it's 1 hour to do the 3 scenarios when you're on your own in a room just working through your answers, and then you come into the oral exam and there'll be 2 board members there, and that's another 2 hours of working through that process. So in that 2 hours, we don't just talk about the 3 scenario questions. We talk about the market that you're working in, the macro, microeconomic factors, the real detailed information about the market and what's happening in there. Then we'll go through the scenario questions. We'll talk a bit about standards, CPD. We'll also talk a bit about the 20 reports that you've submitted, and then we'll have a bit of a wind up at the end of that. So that's the sort of 2-hour breakdown. I mentioned there's a website which has all the standards New Zealand valuers are governed by, but I think if you go through PINS, they can talk to the standards committee, who do have quite a neat one-page sort of A3 presentation of where the current standards are at, and they also have some details about the history of the changes of the standards since probably the late 90s. Yeah, I mean, I guess that for your one, Rachel, you could maybe do it slightly differently and get the 60 CPD points or whatever in the 3 years prior. The commitment to having to do 20 CPD points per year officially only. Right. Okay, so it sounds like, Rachel, you do have to do your 20 per year. I've mostly focused on registered valuers, knowing that they have to do 20 a year, but it sounds like for grad what it was about, because we might come back to some of those CPD items and quiz you on that a bit more. Practice, Michael, is to have a summary of your methodology in your report. You should be explaining what method you've used and then linking that evidence to the answer. What we do require in the registration requirements manual is that if it's not in your report, the appendix that you send and all your workings in for the 20 reports has to show how you've got to your answer. So you can put a lot more detail in the working papers behind the reports that you submit. But I think something as fundamental as methodology in that. The examiners, well, the board's comprised of 5 different people, and we mix up the examination. Yeah, the requirement is generally for a 3-year full-time sort of practical experience. That's always a slight grey area, I guess, is that sort of more than 25, 30 hours a week. The board would probably show some leniencies provided you were doing sort of 25 to 30 hours a week of real valuation work. Ultimately, though, I guess it all comes out in the wash during the exam. If you haven't done enough practical experience, you might struggle to get through. But there are people that do sort of full-time or sort of part-time study and part-time work, and provided you can evidence that you're putting in a fairly serious amount of weekly work, which might be around at least that 30 hours, 25, 30 hours, then you would be considered for reasonably full-time work. Yeah, it generally is 3 years post-graduation, Chris, but it might be different. I mean, we sometimes get mature students and that who've gone back and had a change of career and direction and do their degree. They might already have some work experience that's relevant to the valuation industry, and we would look at that as well. And as I say, some graduates are doing part-time study and part-time work, and providing they're putting in sort of 25, 30 hours a week of actual valuation work, then we would take that into consideration as well. So it doesn't automatically have to be 3 years post-graduation. So the May exams, I thought, would have been notified to valuers by now. Charlie, I'll make a note of that and see. I'll talk to Michelle Doyle, the registrar, and just see when those will be notified, and ask her to get in touch with you. Yeah, so the requirement there, Shane, is that you have to have 3 referees, of which 2 have to be registered valuers, and 1 can be anybody else who's more of a character reference, I guess, but you do have to have 2 registered valuers. So if there's any problem, I mean, we'd always expect that your supervisor would be a referee. If the supervisor is not a referee, that's probably not a great sign for the graduate or the leading into the exam. You could get another registered valuer from a different firm, provided they sort of knew you well enough and knew your kind of work in that. But the more removed you get, I guess the less weight goes on to the referee's writings. Demonstrate a hypo sub valuation would be if you're doing conversion to lifestyle blocks, in which case that is subdivision type activity, and if you're valuing in that kind of market, we'd expect to see something that shows how your sort of capability and knowledge of doing subdivisions for lifestyle. But if you're in the more larger scale productive rural area, then we wouldn't expect you to do hypo sub work.